The story of America begins not with certainty, but with dreams and distant shores, where myth mingles with memory in the mists of the Atlantic. According to the tales passed down through generations, brave souls crossed treacherous seas, guided by little more than hope and the promise of something indefinable, a new world where old rules might not apply. These early voyagers, like pilgrims following a star, carried with them not just possessions, but possibilities. They spoke of a land where forests stretched beyond the horizon, where rivers ran clear as crystal, and where a person might carve out a destiny unbounded by the ancient hierarchies of Europe. In wooden ships that groaned against the waves, families huddled together, whispering prayers to various gods, each vessel a small world unto itself, carrying the seeds of a nation not yet imagined. Envision, if you will, the morning of May 14th, 1607, when 3 ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery, dropped anchor in a sheltered bay along the Virginia coast. The 104 souls aboard had endured 4 months at sea, their bodies weakened by the journey, their minds filled with equal measures of fear and anticipation. They named their settlement Jamestown, after their distant king, not knowing that this fragile foothold would become the first permanent English settlement in the Americas. The early years were brutal beyond imagination. Disease, starvation, and conflict with the Powhatan Confederacy nearly destroyed the colony. During the winter of 1609 to 1610, remembered as the starving time, desperate colonists resorted to eating leather, rats, and in the darkest moments, even the unthinkable. Of 500 colonists, only 60 survived to see spring. Yet from these desperate beginnings emerged something enduring. A man named John Rolfe, who had lost his wife and child on the voyage to Virginia, discovered that Caribbean tobacco grew well in Virginia soil. This golden leaf would save the colony, creating the first profitable export and establishing patterns of labor and land use that would shape the continent's future. In 1619, 2 events occurred that would echo through the centuries. The first representative assembly in the Americas convened in a Jamestown church, and a Dutch ship arrived bearing 20 Africans, beginning the tragic chapter of American slavery that would haunt the nation's conscience for centuries to come. As you settle deeper into this tale, visualize the Mayflower dropping anchor in Cape Cod Bay on a gray November morning in 1620. Unlike the Jamestown adventurers seeking profit, these pilgrims sought something more elusive, religious freedom. Before disembarking, 41 men gathered in the ship's cabin to sign the Mayflower Compact, agreeing to form a civil body politic and submit to laws made for the common good. This simple document, born of necessity, planted seeds of self-governance that would bloom in ways its signers could never foresee. The Pilgrims' first winter was harsh, claiming half their number, but with the aid of Squanto, a Patuxet man who had learned English during his own tragic odyssey of enslavement and return, they learned to cultivate corn, extract sap from maple trees, and catch fish in the unfamiliar waters. Through the decades that followed, waves of settlers established distinct societies along the Atlantic coast. The Puritans of Massachusetts Bay created a city upon a hill, their governor John Winthrop's vision of a model Christian community that would inspire the world. Their emphasis on education led to the founding of Harvard College in 1636, just 6 years after the colony's establishment. In the middle colonies, different dreams took root. William Penn's Pennsylvania became a holy experiment in religious tolerance, where Quakers, Germans, Scots, Irish, and others lived in relative harmony. The Dutch in New Netherland, before the English seized it and renamed it New York, created a commercial hub where 18 languages could be heard on the streets of New Amsterdam. To the south, the Chesapeake colonies of Virginia and Maryland developed around tobacco cultivation, creating a society of scattered plantations rather than compact towns. The Carolina colonies, established later, fostered rice and indigo cultivation in the Low Country, while backcountry settlers carved out small farms from the wilderness. Georgia, the last of the 13 colonies, founded in 1733 by James Oglethorpe as a buffer against Spanish Florida and a refuge for debtors, added its own character to the emerging American tapestry. As the 18th century progressed, these diverse colonies began to develop common characteristics that set them apart from their European origins. The availability of land, unimaginable to most Europeans, created a society where ordinary people could aspire to property ownership. The chronic labor shortage gave workers bargaining power unknown in the Old World. Distance from European authority fostered habits of self-reliance and self-governance. Colonial assemblies, though limited in power, provided laboratories for political experimentation. Town meetings in New England, county courts in Virginia, and urban corporations in Philadelphia and New York created multiple venues for colonists to practice governance. The Great Awakening of the 1740s swept through the colonies like wildfire, as preachers like George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards challenged established churches and emphasized personal religious experience. This spiritual revolution democratized religion and created bonds across colonial boundaries, as people from Georgia to New Hampshire shared in the emotional fervor of revival meetings. The movement's emphasis on individual judgment in spiritual matters would later translate into political ideas about individual rights and resistance to arbitrary authority. By 1750, over 1 million people called themselves Americans, though they remained subjects of the British Crown. They had cleared forests, built cities, established colleges, created representative institutions, and developed thriving economies. Ships built in New England sailed the world's oceans. Pennsylvania iron found markets throughout the Atlantic world. Southern planters sent tobacco, rice, and indigo to European markets. A distinctive American culture was emerging, blending English traditions with influences from other European cultures, African knowledge and artistry, and Native American crops and techniques. Benjamin Franklin, the Philadelphia printer who would become America's first international celebrity, embodied this new American spirit, practical, innovative, and confident. As you sink deeper into peaceful slumber, consider these colonial Americans going about their daily lives, unaware that within a generation they would challenge the might of the British Empire and create a new nation conceived in liberty. Growing discord and taxation, 1760s. As the 1760s dawned, the relationship between Britain and her American colonies resembled a family whose members had grown apart without quite realizing it. Visualize, as you settle more comfortably into rest, the vast Atlantic Ocean that separated parent from child, 3,000 miles of rolling waves that meant messages took months to cross, that royal governors arrived knowing little of local conditions, and that colonists developed their own ways of doing things in the long silences between communications. This distance, both physical and psychological, had allowed Americans to govern themselves in many practical matters, while still professing loyalty to a king most had never seen, and a parliament in which they had no representation. The 7 Years' War, known in America as the French and Indian War, had just ended in 1763 with Britain's stunning victory over France. Consider the victory celebrations in colonial cities, where bonfires blazed and church bells rang to celebrate the removal of the French threat from North America. Young George Washington, who had gained fame fighting alongside British regulars, returned to his Mount Vernon plantation, believing the future bright for English-speaking peoples on the continent. But wars, even victorious ones, exact their price. Britain's national debt had nearly doubled during the conflict, rising to a staggering £137 million. Looking at their prosperous American colonies, British politicians saw an obvious solution. Surely these colonists, who had benefited from British protection, should help pay for their own defence. In the panelled chambers of Westminster, King George III and his ministers viewed the situation with what seemed like impeccable logic. The war had been fought partly to protect American colonists from French and Indian threats. British troops remained stationed in America to guard against future dangers. The colonists enjoyed the protection of the Royal Navy, the world's most powerful fleet. Why shouldn't they contribute to these expenses? To men who had never seen American shores, who knew the colonies only through statistics and reports, this seemed entirely reasonable. They could not feel the pride of colonists who believed they had already contributed through local taxes, militia service, and wartime suffering. They could not understand how Americans had grown accustomed to managing their own affairs. The first tremor of the coming earthquake came with the Sugar Act of 1764. As you nestle deeper into restfulness, contemplate merchants in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia gathering in coffeehouses and taverns, their faces creased with worry as they calculated how the new duties on molasses would affect their trade with the West Indies. The act not only imposed taxes, but also strengthened enforcement mechanisms, empowering customs officials and admiralty courts that operated without juries. James Otis, a fiery Boston lawyer, articulated what many felt when he argued that taxation without representation violated the ancient rights of Englishmen. His pamphlet, The Rights of the British Colonies Asserted and Proved, spread through the colonies like seeds on the wind, planting ideas that would later bloom into revolution. Then came the Stamp Act of 1765, and with it, the first coordinated colonial resistance. Feel the shock that ran through colonial society when they learned that every legal document, every newspaper, every deck of playing cards would require a stamped paper purchased from royal distributors. This was not a distant tax on foreign trade, but a direct levy that touched every colonist's daily life. In Virginia's House of Burgesses, a young lawyer named Patrick Henry rose to speak. His words, though softly begun, built to a crescendo that echoed through the chamber. Caesar had his Brutus, Charles I his Cromwell, and George III. Cries of "treason" interrupted him, but Henry concluded, "may profit by their example." The Burgesses passed his Virginia resolves, asserting that only colonial assemblies had the right to tax colonists. Across the colonies, resistance took many forms. In Boston, a group calling themselves the Sons of Liberty organized protests that forced stamp distributors to resign. Witness the August night when an angry crowd surrounded the elegant home of Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson, a man who had spent his life serving Massachusetts, but now found himself branded an enemy of liberty. The mob destroyed his furniture, scattered his papers, and even tore down his walls. Hutchinson, hiding in a neighbor's house, listened to the destruction of a lifetime's possessions, including a manuscript history of Massachusetts he had spent years writing. Such violence troubled many colonists, but the anger behind it was real and widespread. The Stamp Act Congress of 1765 marked a crucial turning point. As autumn leaves fell, delegates from 9 colonies gathered in New York City, the first time the colonies had united in opposition to British policy. These men, lawyers and merchants and planters, dressed in their finest clothes and powdered wigs, debated in measured tones that belied the radical nature of their actions. They produced a declaration of rights and grievances that acknowledged Parliament's authority to regulate trade, but denied its right to impose internal taxes. More importantly, they had shown that separate colonies could act together when their liberties were threatened. The economic weapon proved most effective. Colonial merchants agreed to boycott British goods until the Stamp Act was repealed. Observe the docks of colonial ports, usually bustling with activity, falling quiet as ships from Britain found no buyers for their cargoes. British merchants and manufacturers, feeling the pinch, petitioned Parliament for relief. In March 1766, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, and celebrations erupted throughout America. Bonfires blazed, church bells rang, and toasts were drunk to King George III. But Parliament simultaneously passed the Declaratory Act, asserting its right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The fundamental issue remained unresolved. Charles Townshend, the clever but unstable Chancellor of the Exchequer, thought he had found a solution. If colonists objected to internal taxes, he would give them external ones. The Townshend Acts of 1767 imposed duties on glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea imported into the colonies. More ominously, they used the revenue to pay royal governors and judges, making these officials independent of colonial assemblies. They also authorized new vice-admiralty courts and legalized writs of assistance, general search warrants that allowed customs officers to enter any building. As you descend deeper into peaceful rest, visualize John Dickinson, a Pennsylvania lawyer, working late into the night by candlelight, crafting his Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. These essays, published in newspapers throughout the colonies, argued eloquently that Parliament could regulate trade but not raise revenue from the colonies. The response to the Townshend Acts revealed how colonial resistance had matured. Merchants organized more sophisticated boycotts, creating committees to enforce non-importation agreements. Women, calling themselves Daughters of Liberty, gathered for spinning bees to produce homespun cloth, making a political statement with every thread they spun. Contemplate these gatherings, women of all social classes working together, their spinning wheels humming like a chorus of protest, transforming domestic craft into political action. They gave up tea, that beloved beverage, brewing Liberty tea from local herbs instead. Fashion became politics as colonists proudly wore homespun rather than British finery. In Boston, tensions reached new heights. British troops had arrived in 1768 to maintain order, but their presence only increased friction. Observe the narrow, winding streets of colonial Boston, where red-coated soldiers stood on corners while residents passed by with averted eyes and muttered curses. Soldiers, poorly paid and often drunk, competed with local workers for jobs during off-duty hours. Street fights became common. The presence of a standing army in peacetime, quartered in the city against the wishes of its inhabitants, violated every principle of English liberty that colonists held dear. Samuel Adams, master propagandist and organizer, kept careful record of every incident, every insult, building a case against military occupation that he spread through his network of correspondence. As the 1760s drew to a close, a pattern had emerged that would define the path to revolution. Each British attempt to assert authority provoked colonial resistance, which in turn prompted stronger British measures. Trust eroded with every cycle. Colonists who had celebrated their British identity now spoke of their rights as Americans. Ideas that would have seemed treasonous in 1760 had become common currency by 1769. The word independence, though not yet spoken aloud in polite company, lurked at the edges of political discourse like a shadow waiting to take form. As you glide toward deeper slumber, reflect on the American colonies on the eve of the 1770s, prosperous, confident, and increasingly united in their opposition to what they saw as tyranny, yet still hoping that their grievances could be resolved within the British Empire they had known and loved. The Boston Crisis and First Resistance, 1770 to 1773. As winter's chill settled over Boston in early 1770, the city resembled a powder keg awaiting a spark. Consider, as you nestle deeper into comfort, the grey March evening when tensions that had simmered for months finally exploded. Snow fell softly on King Street as a lone British sentry, Private Hugh White, stood guard outside the custom house. A young apprentice named Edward Garrick passed by, taunting the soldier about an unpaid bill his officer supposedly owed. When White struck the boy with his musket butt, church bells began to ring, not calling people to worship, but summoning them to confrontation. Within minutes, an angry crowd gathered, their breath forming clouds in the cold air as they hurled snowballs, ice chunks, and insults at the increasingly nervous soldier. Captain Thomas Preston led 7 soldiers to White's relief, their muskets loaded, bayonets gleaming in the lamplight. The crowd pressed closer, daring the soldiers to fire, believing they wouldn't dare without authorization from a civil magistrate. Someone threw a club that struck a soldier. Another soldier slipped on the ice. In the confusion, someone shouted, "Fire!" Whether Preston, a soldier, or someone in the crowd, no one could later say with certainty. The soldiers' muskets cracked in the night air. When the smoke cleared, 5 colonists lay dead or dying in the reddening snow. Among them was Crispus Attucks, a man of African and Native American descent, who would be remembered as the first to die in what would eventually become the Revolutionary War, though that conflict was still years away. The aftermath of what Samuel Adams immediately branded the Boston Massacre revealed both the growing divide between Britain and America and the lingering bonds that still connected them. Paul Revere's engraving of the event, showing British soldiers firing in organized fashion at peaceful citizens, became one of history's most effective pieces of propaganda, copies spreading throughout the colonies within weeks. Yet when the soldiers stood trial, they were defended by John Adams, Samuel's cousin, who believed that even the king's soldiers deserved justice. His skillful defense resulted in acquittals for Preston and most of his men, demonstrating that the rule of law still functioned even amid growing hostility. As you sink into deeper rest, contemplate Adams returning home after the trial, torn between his duty to justice and his sympathy for the patriot cause. Following the bloodshed in Boston, a strange calm descended over the colonies. Lord North, who had become Prime Minister, persuaded Parliament to repeal most of the Townshend duties in April 1770, keeping only the tax on tea as a symbol of Parliament's right to tax. Many colonists, weary of boycotts and confrontation, were ready to return to normal trade. Merchants who had suffered under non-importation agreements eagerly resumed buying British goods. It seemed that the crisis might pass, that the British Empire might heal its wounds. But beneath this surface calm, fundamental questions remained unresolved, and networks of correspondence kept revolutionary ideas alive and circulating. In Virginia, the House of Burgesses had been experimenting with new forms of resistance. When Governor Boutetourt dissolved them for protesting British policies, the members simply reconvened at the nearby Raleigh Tavern, transforming a social space into a center of political organization. Visualize these planters in their fine coats, gathering in the tavern's Apollo room under the motto Hilaritas sapientiae et bonae vitae proles, jollity is the offspring of wisdom and good living, to discuss matters that were anything but jolly. Young Thomas Jefferson was among them, his brilliant mind already formulating ideas about natural rights and the limits of governmental power that would later reshape the world. The period from 1770 to 1773 saw the development of institutions and ideas that would prove crucial when crisis returned. Committees of correspondence, first organized by Samuel Adams in Boston, spread throughout the colonies like a nervous system, transmitting information and coordinating resistance. These committees, often meeting in taverns, private homes, or churches, created an alternative structure of governance that existed parallel to royal authority. When you envision these meetings, see ordinary men, merchants, farmers, artisans, lawyers, gathering by candlelight to read letters from other colonies, debate responses, and slowly build a sense of American identity that transcended colonial boundaries. In this period of relative quiet, some of the Revolution's most important intellectual work took place. In Massachusetts, John Adams published his Novanglus essays, arguing that the colonies were connected to Britain only through the Crown, not Parliament, a constitutional theory that would have been radical a decade earlier, but now seemed merely logical to many Americans. In Virginia, George Mason drafted documents on colonial rights that circulated in manuscript form among the plantation elite. These writings, though less dramatic than street protests, laid the philosophical groundwork for independence by reimagining the constitutional relationship between Britain and America. The tea tax, that one remaining symbol of Parliament's authority, continued to rankle. Colonial women maintained their boycott of British tea, and smuggling of Dutch tea flourished. The East India Company, one of Britain's most powerful corporations, faced bankruptcy partly due to millions of pounds of tea sitting unsold in its warehouses. Lord North's government, seeking to save the company and reassert the tea tax, passed the Tea Act of 1773. This law allowed the company to sell tea directly to the colonies through chosen consignees, bypassing colonial merchants and actually reducing the price of tea even with the tax included. It seemed a clever solution. Colonists would get cheaper tea, the company would be saved, and the tax would be quietly accepted. But Lord North had miscalculated badly. The Tea Act united colonial merchants, who saw their livelihoods threatened by the monopoly, with patriots who viewed any tax as tyranny. As you float toward deeper slumber, see the first East India Company ships approaching American harbors in late 1773, their holds filled with tea that would ignite a revolution. In New York and Philadelphia, mass meetings convinced the tea consignees to resign, and the ships returned to England with their cargoes unsold. In Charleston, the tea was unloaded but locked in warehouses, where it would remain until sold at auction to fund the Revolutionary War years later. Boston proved different. Governor Thomas Hutchinson, whose sons were among the tea consignees, was determined to uphold the law. When the ship Dartmouth arrived in Boston Harbor on November 28, 1773, Hutchinson insisted it would not leave until its tea was unloaded and the duties paid. Mass meetings at Old South Meeting House, attended by thousands from Boston and surrounding towns, demanded the tea be sent back. For 20 days, the standoff continued. Guards prevented the tea from being unloaded while Hutchinson refused to let the ships depart. By law, if the duties weren't paid within 20 days, customs officials could seize the cargo. On December 16th, the final day before seizure, another mass meeting at Old South Meeting House waited for word that Hutchinson would relent. When messengers returned with his final refusal, Samuel Adams rose and declared, "This meeting can do nothing further to save the country." It was a prearranged signal. From the gallery, a voice cried out, "Boston Harbor a teapot tonight!" Men disguised as Mohawk Indians, their faces darkened with soot and lamp black, emerged from the crowd. Watch them marching down to Griffin's Wharf in the gathering darkness, maintaining an eerie discipline. No general disorder occurred. This was a carefully planned operation, not a mob action. For 3 hours, the Indians methodically broke open 342 chests of tea and dumped their contents into Boston Harbor while thousands watched from the shore in approving silence. They worked efficiently, taking care to damage nothing but the tea. When they accidentally broke a padlock, they later replaced it. One man who tried to stuff tea into his pockets was roughly handled and expelled. As the last tea chest splashed into the harbor, the participants melted back into the crowd, many heading to the South End where sympathetic residents had left buckets of water to wash off their disguises. The tide carried the tea into the harbor, where it piled up in windrows along the shore for days afterward. The Boston Tea Party, as it would later be called, was both an ending and a beginning. It marked the final breakdown of attempts to find a peaceful solution within the existing constitutional framework. As you descend into peaceful sleep, see the tea leaves floating on the dark waters of Boston Harbor, carrying with them the last hopes of reconciliation. In London, when news arrived of Boston's defiance, even friends of America were shocked. The time for compromise had passed. The British government would respond with unprecedented harshness, and the colonies would have to decide whether to submit or resist. The tea in Boston Harbor had dissolved more than anyone yet realized. It had dissolved the bonds of empire, though the formal break was still years away. From tea to revolution, 1773 to 1775, when news of the Boston Tea Party reached London in January 1774, the reaction was swift and severe. Consider the scene in the royal palace as King George III, normally composed and measured, declared with uncharacteristic emotion, "We must master them, or totally leave them to themselves and treat them as aliens." In Parliament, even members sympathetic to American grievances agreed that Boston's destruction of private property demanded punishment. Lord North, usually inclined toward conciliation, now spoke of the need for firmness. The British government, feeling its authority challenged as never before, prepared a response that would transform a tax dispute into a revolutionary crisis. The coercive acts, which Americans would call the Intolerable Acts, passed through Parliament in the spring of 1774 with large majorities. As you settle deeper into rest, witness the scene in the House of Commons as Lord North outlined each punitive measure. The Boston Port Act closed the harbor until the destroyed tea was paid for, threatening the city's economic survival. The Massachusetts Government Act essentially revoked the colony's charter, limiting town meetings and making the council appointive rather than elective. The Administration of Justice Act allowed British officials accused of crimes to be tried in England rather than Massachusetts. The Quartering Act permitted troops to be housed in private buildings. Each act struck at freedoms the colonists had long considered their birthright. In Boston, the reality of these acts hit home as warships sealed the harbor on June 1, 1774. See the usually bustling wharves falling silent, merchant ships trapped at anchor, and thousands of workers, longshoremen, sailors, shipbuilders, rope makers, suddenly unemployed. Yet rather than isolating Boston as the British intended, the port's closure united the colonies as never before. From South Carolina came rice, from Maryland and Virginia came corn and flour, from Connecticut came sheep. George Washington himself contributed £50. The cause of Boston became the cause of America, as colonists recognized that what Parliament could do to Massachusetts, it could do to any colony. General Thomas Gage, the new military governor of Massachusetts, arrived to find a city seething with barely suppressed rebellion. Observe this professional soldier, who had spent years in America and married an American wife, trying to govern a population that viewed him as a tyrant. When he attempted to appoint council members under the new Government Act, most refused to serve or resigned under public pressure. When he tried to hold court sessions, jurors refused to take oaths. Town meetings, now illegal without his permission, continued to meet anyway, simply calling themselves committees or conventions. The machinery of royal government ground to a halt, not through violence but through massive civil disobedience. Throughout the summer of 1774, the colonies buzzed with activity as they prepared to meet the crisis collectively. In Virginia, when Governor Dunmore dissolved the House of Burgesses for expressing sympathy with Boston, the members again convened at the Raleigh Tavern. See these planters, including George Washington, Patrick Henry, and Thomas Jefferson, gathering in the heat of a Virginia summer to issue a call for a Continental Congress. Similar scenes played out in other colonies as legislative bodies, committees, and mass meetings selected delegates for an unprecedented gathering. The very act of choosing representatives for an intercolonial assembly without royal authorization was revolutionary, though few yet spoke of revolution. The First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia on September 5, 1774, in Carpenter's Hall, a modest building that belied the momentous nature of the gathering. As you glide deeper into peaceful slumber, visualize 56 delegates from 12 colonies, Georgia alone abstaining, entering the hall that first morning. They represented a remarkable cross-section of colonial leadership, lawyers like John Adams, merchants like John Jay, planters like George Washington, and would have included Benjamin Franklin had he not still been in England, desperately trying to negotiate a settlement. These men, many meeting for the first time, had to forge unity from diversity while deciding how far to push their resistance. The debates in Congress revealed the range of colonial opinion. Joseph Galloway of Pennsylvania proposed a plan of union that would create an American Parliament to work alongside the British Parliament, a last attempt at constitutional compromise. Patrick Henry of Virginia declared, The distinctions between Virginians, Pennsylvanians, New Yorkers, and New Englanders are no more. I am not a Virginian, but an American. Yet many delegates still hoped for reconciliation. They addressed respectful petitions to the king while organizing comprehensive economic warfare through the Continental Association, which would enforce a complete boycott of British goods and, if necessary, a ban on exports to Britain. Throughout the colonies, the Continental Association transformed American society. Local committees elected to enforce the boycott became de facto governments, inspecting merchants' records, publishing names of violators, and organizing alternative domestic production. Watchwomen gathering to spin thread and weave cloth, making homespun fashionable as a symbol of patriotic virtue. See farmers experimenting with crops that could replace British imports, and craftsmen working to produce goods previously purchased from the mother country. The boycott was more than economic pressure. It was a massive exercise in collective self-discipline that united Americans in common purpose. In Massachusetts, as autumn turned to winter, the situation grew increasingly tense. General Gage's attempts to seize colonial gunpowder stores led to massive mobilizations of militia. In September, when British troops marched to Cambridge to confiscate powder, false rumors that they had fired on civilians brought 20,000 armed men streaming toward Boston within 24 hours. Though violence was averted when the truth emerged, the powder alarm demonstrated that New England was a tinderbox awaiting a spark. Colonial militias began serious training, and special companies of Minutemen formed, ready to march at a moment's notice. As 1775 dawned, both sides prepared for a confrontation that seemed increasingly inevitable. In Parliament, Lord North offered what he considered a generous compromise. Any colony that taxed itself to Britain's satisfaction would be exempt from parliamentary taxation. But this olive branch satisfied no one in America, where the issue had moved beyond taxation to fundamental questions of self-governance. In Virginia, delegates to a provincial convention gathered at St. John's Church in Richmond. There, on March 23rd, Patrick Henry delivered the speech that would echo through history. As you sink toward deeper rest, hear his voice rising in that small church. Is life so dear, or peace so sweet, as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. General Gage received orders from London to take decisive action against the rebellion's leaders. His intelligence network informed him that the colonists had stockpiled military supplies in Concord, about 20 miles from Boston. On the night of April 18, 1775, he dispatched 700 troops under Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith to seize these stores. But the colonists' own intelligence network was equally effective. Witness the scene in Boston as British soldiers quietly assembled on the common, thinking their movements secret. Yet watchful eyes observed them, and soon 2 riders, Paul Revere and William Dawes, were galloping through the countryside, warning that the regulars were coming. In Lexington, as dawn broke on April 19th, Captain John Parker assembled his company of 77 militiamen on the village green. These were not professional soldiers, but farmers, artisans, and tradesmen, many related by blood or marriage, who had drilled together for months. As the British advance guard under Major John Pitcairn appeared through the morning mist, Parker allegedly told his men, "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." The British officers ordered the militia to disperse. Parker, seeing his men vastly outnumbered, ordered them to comply. As they began to scatter, a shot rang out, from which side no one knows. British soldiers, their blood up, fired a volley and charged with bayonets. 8 Americans died on Lexington Green. The British column marched on to Concord, where they found most of the military supplies already removed or hidden. At the North Bridge, they encountered a larger force of militia. This time, when British soldiers fired, the Americans fired back, killing and wounding several redcoats. As the British began their return march to Boston, the countryside erupted. Militiamen from dozens of towns converged on the road, firing from behind stone walls, trees, and houses. The disciplined British retreat turned into a near rout. Only the arrival of reinforcements under Lord Percy prevented complete disaster. By day's end, British casualties numbered 273, while the Americans lost 95. As night fell on April 19, 1775, everything had changed. The shots fired at Lexington and Concord echoed across the Atlantic world. Within days, thousands of militiamen surrounded Boston, beginning a siege that would last nearly a year. The Second Continental Congress, scheduled to convene in May, would no longer debate petitions and boycotts, but would have to direct a war. As you drift into peaceful sleep, see the smoke clearing from the battle road, revealing not just dead and wounded men, but the wreckage of the old colonial relationship. The argument over rights and taxes had become a test of arms. Americans who had insisted they were merely defending their traditional liberties within the British Empire would soon have to decide whether those liberties required independence. The revolution that had been brewing for more than a decade had finally begun, though no one yet knew where it would lead. The shot heard round the world, 1775. As the sun rose on April 20th, 1775, church bells tolled across New England, not calling the faithful to worship, but spreading news that would reshape the world. Consider, as you settle deeper into restfulness, the roads leading to Boston clogged with militiamen, their muskets gleaming in the morning light, their faces set with determination. From New Hampshire came grizzled veterans of the French and Indian War. From Connecticut marched young men who had never fired a shot in anger. From Rhode Island traveled entire companies who had drilled together for months. Within days, 15,000 Americans surrounded Boston, trapping General Gage's army in the city they had come to pacify. The siege of Boston began not with careful planning, but with spontaneous uprising. Visualize the confusion in those early days as militia companies arrived without coordination, camping wherever they found space, electing their own officers, and following orders only when they agreed with them. Artemus Ward, a portly Massachusetts general suffering from kidney stones, found himself commanding this irregular force by default rather than design. These citizen soldiers had rushed from their farms and workshops with little more than their weapons and the clothes on their backs. They lacked tents, standard ammunition, proper food supplies, and any semblance of military organization. Yet they had trapped one of the world's most professional armies simply through their determination and numbers. In Philadelphia, the Second Continental Congress convened on May 10th in the Pennsylvania State House, the same building where independence would later be declared. As you nestle deeper into peaceful slumber, envision the delegates entering the assembly room, their faces grave with the knowledge that they were no longer merely protesting, but directing armed resistance against their sovereign. John Hancock of Massachusetts was elected president, his bold signature soon to become synonymous with defiance. Among the new delegates was Benjamin Franklin, recently returned from London, where his efforts at reconciliation had failed, and Thomas Jefferson, a tall, red-haired Virginian whose pen would soon give voice to American aspirations. While Congress debated, events in the field moved rapidly. On the same day Congress convened, Ethan Allen and his Green Mountain Boys, accompanied by Benedict Arnold, captured Fort Ticonderoga on Lake Champlain. Contemplate these rough frontiersmen surprising the sleeping garrison, with Allen allegedly demanding surrender, in the name of the great Jehovah and the Continental Congress. Though neither had authorized the attack, the fort's cannon, desperately needed for the siege of Boston, would make an epic journey over frozen rivers and snow-covered mountains the following winter. 2 days later, Seth Warner captured Crown Point, giving Americans control of the strategic Lake Champlain corridor. Congress faced an agonizing dilemma. They were directing military operations while still professing loyalty to King George III. Many delegates, particularly John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, hoped that a show of force combined with humble petitions would bring the British government to its senses. On July 5th, Congress adopted the Olive Branch Petition, professing loyalty to the Crown and begging the King to restrain Parliament and his ministers. The next day, showing the confusion of their position, they issued a declaration of the causes and necessity of taking up arms, justifying their resistance while denying any intention of independence. The question of military command required immediate attention. The New England militia besieging Boston needed leadership, supplies, and legitimacy. John Adams, recognizing the need to make the conflict truly continental, nominated George Washington of Virginia as Commander-in-Chief. Observe Washington, tall and imposing in his military uniform, which he wore to Congress to remind delegates of his military experience, accepting the command with characteristic modesty, refusing any salary beyond expenses. His appointment transformed a regional uprising into an American war, binding the southern colonies to New England's cause. Before Washington could reach Boston, the war's first major battle erupted on the Charlestown Peninsula. British generals, contemptuous of colonial military abilities, planned to break the siege by seizing high ground around Boston. But colonial intelligence learned of the plan. On the night of June 16th, over 1,000 Americans under Colonel William Prescott marched onto the peninsula and began digging fortifications on Breed's Hill, though history would remember it as Bunker Hill. As you sink deeper into rest, witness these men working through the night, their shovels striking sparks from the rocky soil, knowing that dawn would bring British cannon fire. When the sun rose on June 17th, British warships in the harbor opened fire on the American positions. General William Howe led 2,200 redcoats across the Charles River to assault what he assumed would be a rabble that would flee at the sight of British bayonets. Instead, the Americans held their fire until the British were almost upon them, legend says until they could see the whites of their eyes. The first British assault was shattered by devastating musket fire. Officers fell in shocking numbers. The British regrouped and attacked again, only to be thrown back with terrible losses. On the third assault, with the Americans nearly out of ammunition, the British finally took the hill. The Battle of Bunker Hill was technically a British victory, but at a terrible cost. Over 1,000 British soldiers, nearly half the attacking force, were killed or wounded, including 92 officers. American losses were less than half that number. As one British officer wrote home, a few more such victories would have shortly put an end to British dominion in America. The battle proved that American militia, when properly positioned and led, could stand against British regulars. More importantly, it showed the British that suppressing the rebellion would require far more than a few regiments and warships. George Washington arrived at Cambridge on July 3rd to take command of what Congress had designated the Continental Army. What he found appalled him. Visualize this Virginia aristocrat, accustomed to order and discipline, surveying the chaotic camps surrounding Boston. Men relieved themselves wherever convenient, officers dressed no differently from privates, soldiers wandered away when they felt like it, and each colony's troops viewed themselves as separate armies. Washington immediately set about creating a real army from this assemblage, instituting strict discipline, regular drills, and proper sanitation. He faced enormous challenges, shortages of powder, food, clothing, and money, plus the fact that most enlistments would expire at year's end. While Washington struggled to create an army, Congress authorized an invasion of Canada, hoping to add a 14th colony to the rebellion. 2 expeditions set out in the fall of 1775. Richard Montgomery led one force north along the traditional Lake Champlain route, while Benedict Arnold led another through the Maine wilderness. Arnold's march became an epic of endurance as his men struggled through swamps and rapids, many dying of exposure and starvation. See these soldiers dragging heavy boats through trackless forests, their clothes in tatters, surviving on shoe leather and pet dogs. Yet somehow the survivors reached the St. Lawrence River. The Canadian campaign initially showed promise. Montgomery captured Montreal in November, and in December he joined Arnold outside Quebec City. On New Year's Eve, in a blinding snowstorm, they launched a desperate assault on the fortified city. The attack failed catastrophically. Montgomery was killed, Arnold severely wounded, and hundreds of Americans captured. The remnants of the invasion force maintained a futile siege until spring, when British reinforcements drove them back to New York. The dream of making Canada the 14th colony died in the snows of Quebec. Throughout the fall and winter of 1775, a curious war developed. Armies faced each other while politicians still spoke of reconciliation. In Virginia, Lord Dunmore, the royal governor, issued a proclamation offering freedom to any slave who would fight for the crown, outraging planters and pushing wavering moderates toward the patriot cause. In Norfolk, Dunmore's forces bombarded the town on New Year's Day, 1776, but patriot forces completed its destruction to deny the British a base. In North Carolina, Scottish Highlander loyalists rose for the king, only to be crushed at Moore's Creek Bridge. Each month of fighting made reconciliation less likely. As 1775 ended, King George III removed any remaining hopes for peace. In August, he had issued a proclamation declaring the colonies in open rebellion. In October, he told Parliament that the rebellion was manifestly carried on for the purpose of establishing an independent empire. When news arrived that the king had refused even to receive the Olive Branch petition and was hiring German mercenaries to help suppress the revolt, many Americans concluded that George III, whom they had continued to regard as a loving father misled by evil ministers, was actually the principal enemy of their liberties. The transformation in American thinking during 1775 was profound. In April, they had taken up arms claiming only to defend their traditional rights as Englishmen. By December, they were creating new governments, raising armies and navies, and beginning to think the unthinkable: complete separation from Britain. As you drift into deeper sleep, reflect on the Continental soldiers shivering in their camps around Boston as 1776 dawned, no longer knowing exactly what they were fighting for, but certain they could no longer go back. The shots fired at Lexington and Concord had indeed been heard around the world, echoing in palace chambers and frontier cabins, in slave quarters and merchant counting houses. What had begun as a family quarrel within the British Empire was becoming something unprecedented, a colonial rebellion founded on universal principles of human rights that would inspire others for centuries to come. Independence declared, 1776. As the year 1776 dawned cold and clear over the American colonies, a pamphlet appeared in Philadelphia that would change the course of human history. Envision, as you nestle deeper into comfort, a modest printing shop where Robert Bell worked through the night-setting type for a work titled simply Common Sense. Its author, Thomas Paine, was an unlikely revolutionary, a failed English corset maker, tax collector, and tobacconist who had arrived in America only 2 years earlier. Yet his words struck the colonies like a thunderbolt. In plain language that any farmer or craftsman could understand, Paine demolished the logic of monarchy and made the case for American independence with a force that took readers' breath away. "Society in every state is a blessing," Paine wrote, "but government, even in its best state, is but a necessary evil." He attacked the very idea of hereditary rule, asking why one man should be born to command and millions born to obey. He ridiculed the notion of an island ruling a continent, of America remaining tied to a nation 3,000 miles away. Most radically, he argued that America had the moral obligation to show the world that Republican government could succeed. Within 3 months, an astonishing 150,000 copies circulated among a population of only 2.5 million. As you drift deeper into restfulness, witness colonists gathering in taverns and homes, passing worn copies hand to hand, reading aloud to those who couldn't read, feeling their mental horizons expand with each page. In the Continental Army camps around Boston, Washington's men read Paine's words and felt their purpose clarified. The general himself had undergone his own transformation. In January, he raised a new flag over his headquarters, 13 stripes representing united colonies, but still bearing the British Union Jack in the corner. By March, that symbol of continued allegiance seemed outdated. On March 17th, Washington achieved his first major victory without firing a shot. During the winter, Henry Knox had accomplished the seemingly impossible, dragging 59 captured cannon from Fort Ticonderoga over 300 miles of frozen terrain. When these guns appeared on Dorchester Heights overlooking Boston Harbor, General Howe realized his position was untenable. The British evacuated Boston, sailing for Halifax with 1,000 Loyalist refugees, never to return. As spring arrived, the political climate shifted as dramatically as the military situation. Provincial congresses and conventions throughout the colonies began debating the previously unthinkable. In March, South Carolina adopted a provisional constitution. In April, North Carolina's delegates were instructed to vote for independence. On May 4th, Rhode Island became the first colony to formally renounce allegiance to King George III. Consider the delegates in each colony wrestling with their consciences, knowing that the decision for independence would make them traitors subject to hanging if the rebellion failed, yet increasingly convinced that no other path remained open. On May 10th, Congress passed a resolution advising colonies to form new governments wherever royal authority had collapsed, which was nearly everywhere. John Adams called this resolution the most important ever taken in America. 5 days later, Virginia's convention instructed its congressional delegates to propose independence. The dam was breaking, yet many delegates still hesitated. The middle colonies, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Maryland, contained large populations of loyalists and religious pacifists. Their delegates needed time to convince constituents and receive new instructions. On June 7, 1776, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia rose in Congress to offer the resolution that would change the world. That these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is, and ought to be, totally dissolved. The words hung in the air of the Pennsylvania State House like an incantation. Some delegates were exhilarated, others terrified. John Adams seconded the motion, but opponents led by John Dickinson succeeded in postponing the final vote until July to allow delegations to receive new instructions. Congress appointed a committee to draft a declaration explaining American actions to the world. The committee included Adams, Franklin, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, Robert Livingston of New York, and a young Virginian who had said little in debates, but whose pen had already proven mighty, Thomas Jefferson. As you sink deeper toward slumber, observe Jefferson in his rented rooms on the second floor of a brick house on 7th and Market Streets, bent over his portable writing desk in the sweltering June heat, struggling to find words equal to the moment. He drew on his own previous writings, on George Mason's Virginia Declaration of Rights, on the political philosophy of John Locke, and on the accumulated grievances of a decade of resistance. The declaration Jefferson drafted was both a lawyer's brief and a philosophical manifesto. It began not with complaints against British policies, but with universal principles. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These words, so familiar now, were revolutionary then. They grounded government not in tradition or force, but in the consent of the governed. They made revolution not just permissible, but obligatory when government became destructive of the people's rights. The committee made few changes to Jefferson's draft, though Franklin improved the flow with small edits, and Adams defended it vigorously. When Congress took up the document on July 2nd, they first had to vote on Lee's resolution for independence. The debate was intense. Dickinson made a last eloquent plea against separation, warning of the dangers of war against the world's greatest military power. Adams responded with what many considered the finest speech of his life, though no record of it survives. When the vote was called, 12 colonies voted for independence. New York's delegates, still lacking instructions, abstained. The deed was done. Yesterday, Adams wrote to his wife Abigail, the greatest question was decided which ever was debated in America, and a greater perhaps never was, nor will be, decided among men. Congress then turned to editing Jefferson's Declaration. For 2 days they picked over every phrase, making changes that pained the sensitive author. They strengthened some passages, weakened others, and most significantly, removed Jefferson's fierce condemnation of the slave trade, recognizing the bitter irony of slaveholders proclaiming that all men are created equal. South Carolina and Georgia would not accept such language, and northern merchants had profited from the trade too. This moral compromise at the nation's birth would haunt America for centuries. As you float deeper into peaceful rest, witness Jefferson wincing as each cherished phrase was altered or struck, while Franklin comforted him with the story of a hatter whose sign was edited until it said simply John Thompson with a picture of a hat. On July 4, 1776, Congress approved the final version of the Declaration of Independence. Contrary to popular myth, not all delegates signed it that day. The formal signing of a parchment copy would come later. But the essential act was done. 13 colonies had declared themselves 13 independent states, united in their determination to be free. That evening, the declaration was delivered to printer John Dunlap, who worked through the night to produce broadside copies. By morning, riders were carrying these broadsides throughout the colonies, spreading the news that would transform subjects into citizens. The first public reading of the Declaration in Philadelphia occurred on July 8th. Visualize the scene in the State House yard as Colonel John Nixon read the words to a large crowd. When he finished, people cheered, bells rang throughout the city, and soldiers fired celebratory volleys. That night, the King's arms were torn down from the State House and burned in a bonfire. Similar scenes occurred throughout the colonies as the Declaration was read. In New York, a crowd pulled down the equestrian statue of George III, melting it down to make musket balls. In Boston, the Declaration was read from the balcony of the State House to crowds that had suffered so much for this moment. Yet declaring independence was one thing, achieving it quite another. Even as Americans celebrated, a massive British fleet approached New York Harbor. The Howe brothers, General William commanding land forces and Admiral Richard commanding the navy, brought an army of 32,000 men, including German mercenaries, Americans called Hessians. This was the largest expeditionary force Britain had ever sent overseas. Washington, trying to defend New York with an army of largely untrained volunteers, faced an impossible task. He had perhaps 19,000 men, many sick with camp diseases, lacking proper equipment, and due to go home when their enlistments expired. The Declaration of Independence transformed the nature of the conflict. This was no longer a rebellion seeking redress of grievances, but a war between sovereign nations. American agents could now seek foreign alliances openly. American ships could be commissioned as warships rather than pirates. Most importantly, Americans now fought for a positive vision, the creation of republican governments based on human equality and consent, rather than merely against British oppression. This vision would sustain them through the dark years ahead, when independence seemed a desperate gamble against overwhelming odds. As July 1776 ended, the consequences of independence began to sink in. Every person in America faced a choice, patriot or loyalist, with neutrality increasingly impossible. Families divided, friendships ended, and communities split. Those who chose loyalty to the crown faced increasing persecution, their property confiscated, their persons threatened, their choice of exile or submission. Those who chose independence knew they risked everything. If captured, they faced the noose. If they failed, they would lose their property, their positions, and possibly their lives. There was no going back. Yet there was also exhilaration in the air. See ordinary Americans in that summer of 1776, farmers, merchants, housewives, artisans, reading or hearing the Declaration's words and feeling part of something larger than themselves. They were no longer provincials on the margin of empire, but citizens of a new nation dedicated to the proposition that people could govern themselves. As you drift toward deeper sleep, contemplate the mixture of fear and hope that filled American hearts as they considered their audacious gamble. They had declared to the world that they were free and independent states. Now they had to make that declaration reality against the greatest military power on earth. The words were written. The war for their meaning had just begun. The darkest hours, 1776 to 1777. Even as the echoes of celebration for independence faded, disaster loomed over New York. Observe as you settle deeper into tranquility the morning of August 27, 1776, when British forces began their assault on American positions on Long Island. Washington had divided his already outnumbered army between Manhattan and Brooklyn, a fatal strategic error. General Howe, learning from his bloody experience at Bunker Hill, refused to make frontal assaults on fortified positions. Instead, he sent a flanking column on a night march through unguarded Jamaica Pass. As dawn broke, Americans found redcoats and Hessians both in front and behind them. The Battle of Long Island became a rout, with Americans fleeing in panic toward their fortifications at Brooklyn Heights. Only the hesitation of British commanders saved the Continental Army from complete destruction. Instead of pressing their advantage, they began formal siege operations, confident the Americans were trapped. But on the night of August 29th to 30th, Washington executed one of his finest moments of the war. In absolute silence, using every available boat manned by Massachusetts fishermen, the entire American army evacuated across the East River to Manhattan. A providential fog rose at dawn, concealing the last retreating units. When the British advanced that morning, they found empty trenches. Washington had saved his army, but the pattern was set. American forces would spend the rest of 1776 in desperate retreat. Manhattan proved indefensible. On September 15th, British forces landed at Kip's Bay, and American militia fled without fighting, some throwing away their muskets to run faster. Washington, arriving on the scene, lost his famous composure, striking fleeing soldiers with the flat of his sword and screaming with frustration. Legend says he would have ridden directly at the enemy in despair had aides not pulled his horse's bridle. The next day brought a small ray of hope when American forces fought well at Harlem Heights, but the overall situation remained grim. Washington withdrew northward, leaving Congress's directive to defend New York City unfulfilled. As autumn colors painted the Hudson Valley, the American cause seemed to be dying with the leaves. Fort Washington, the last American stronghold on Manhattan, fell on November 16th, with the loss of nearly 3,000 men captured. 4 days later, Fort Lee across the Hudson in New Jersey was abandoned so hastily that the British captured the Americans' breakfast still cooking over fires. Washington's army, reduced to barely 3,000 effective soldiers, fled across New Jersey with British forces in hot pursuit. As you drift deeper into rest, visualize these ragged soldiers, many without shoes, leaving bloody footprints in the November frost, their faith in the cause tested by each agonizing mile of retreat. The psychological impact of these defeats was devastating. The same citizens who had cheered the Declaration in July now wondered if independence was a tragic mistake. When Washington's army retreated through New Jersey towns, many inhabitants who had been patriots in summer now refused to sell supplies or offer shelter. The New Jersey militia evaporated. When Congress called for new enlistments, few responded. On December 12th, fearing capture, Congress fled Philadelphia for Baltimore, giving Washington dictatorial powers before they left. It seemed the American experiment might end before its first birthday. Thomas Paine, marching with the retreating army, captured the moment in new writings. "These are the times that try men's souls," he wrote in The American Crisis, published on December 19th. "The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman." Washington ordered these words read to his troops, trying to rekindle the fire that seemed almost extinguished. Yet words alone could not change the military reality. Most enlistments would expire on December 31st, and few soldiers showed any inclination to re-enlist. Without a dramatic reversal, the Continental Army would simply cease to exist. Washington knew he needed a bold stroke to save the cause. Though outnumbered and outgunned, he held one advantage: the enemy's contempt. British and Hessian forces had gone into winter quarters, confident that the American rabble was finished. Hessian troops occupied Trenton, New Jersey, celebrating Christmas in the German fashion. Their commander, Colonel Johann Rohl, dismissed warnings about American attacks, allegedly keeping a note warning of danger in his pocket unread while he played cards. This overconfidence gave Washington his opportunity. On Christmas night, 1776, Washington divided his force for a three-pronged attack on Trenton. As you sink deeper toward slumber, see the scene at McConkey's Ferry as American soldiers embarked on boats to cross the ice-choked Delaware River. Snow began falling, driven by a fierce wind. Men without coats wrapped themselves in blankets. The password for the night was "Victory or Death," not mere bravado, but recognition that failure meant the end. The crossing took far longer than planned. 2 of the 3 attacking columns never made it across. Washington's main force didn't complete the crossing until 3 a.m., putting them hours behind schedule. The 9-mile march to Trenton became an ordeal. Soldiers slipped on icy roads, and 2 men froze to death. Officers worried that wet powder had made their muskets useless, but Washington grimly ordered them to rely on bayonets. As dawn broke on December 26th, the Americans burst into Trenton from 2 directions. The surprised Hessians tumbled from their quarters, trying to form ranks in the streets. The battle was brief but decisive. American artillery dominated the streets while infantry cleared houses. Colonel Rohl, finally reading the warning note, tried to organize resistance but fell mortally wounded. Within 90 minutes, it was over. Nearly 900 Hessians surrendered, while American casualties numbered only 4 wounded, plus the 2 frozen on the march. The victory at Trenton electrified American morale. Soldiers who had been ready to go home re-enlisted. New recruits appeared. Congress returned to Philadelphia. But Washington wasn't finished. When British General Cornwallis marched on Trenton with 8,000 men, Washington slipped away in the night and struck at Princeton on January 3, 1777. In fierce fighting that saw Washington personally rally troops under fire, Americans defeated British regulars in open combat. These twin victories didn't win the war, but they saved the Revolution at its darkest hour. The British withdrew from most of New Jersey, and Washington took his army into winter quarters at Morristown. The year 1777 brought new challenges and opportunities. The British developed a strategy to split the colonies by sending General John Burgoyne south from Canada along the Lake Champlain corridor, while Howe moved north from New York, the 2 forces to meet at Albany. If successful, this would isolate New England, considered the heart of the rebellion. But coordination proved impossible. Howe, instead of moving up the Hudson, decided to capture Philadelphia, the American capital. Burgoyne, supremely confident, began his invasion in June with a mixed force of British regulars, German mercenaries, loyalists, and Native American allies. Burgoyne's campaign began promisingly. Fort Ticonderoga, the great fortress Americans had held since 1775, fell without a fight when British artillery appeared on a height Americans had thought inaccessible. But as Burgoyne pushed south through the wilderness, his problems multiplied. His supply line stretched longer with each mile. American forces felled trees across roads, destroyed bridges, and diverted streams to create swamps. What should have been a quick march became a crawling advance of a mile a day. Contemplate Burgoyne's increasingly desperate army, hauling heavy cannon through trackless forests, swatting at mosquitoes, running low on food, while American militia gathered like storm clouds on their flanks. Meanwhile, Howe's campaign against Philadelphia succeeded tactically but failed strategically. On September 11, 1777, he defeated Washington at Brandywine Creek, outflanking the American position in a replay of Long Island. 2 weeks later, after a surprise American attack at Germantown nearly succeeded before dissolving in fog and confusion, Howe occupied Philadelphia. Congress fled again, this time to York, Pennsylvania. But holding Philadelphia meant little while Burgoyne faced disaster in the north. Washington stationed his army at Valley Forge, maintaining pressure on the British in Philadelphia while the decisive campaign unfolded along the Hudson. The turning point came at Saratoga. American forces under Horatio Gates, reinforced by militia and led tactically by the brilliant Benedict Arnold, surrounded Burgoyne's dwindling army. On September 19th at Freeman's Farm and October 7th at Bemis Heights, American forces repulsed British attempts to break through. Arnold, defying Gates's orders, led charges that shattered British lines, taking a bullet in the leg that would leave him crippled. Burgoyne, out of options, surrendered his entire army on October 17, 1777. Nearly 6,000 British and German soldiers marched into captivity as American bands played Yankee Doodle, the song British had used to mock colonials. Saratoga changed everything. In Paris, French officials who had been secretly aiding America now moved toward open alliance. The American envoys, Benjamin Franklin, playing the role of simple American philosopher, John Adams, all prickly honesty, and Silas Deane, whose financial dealings would later prove controversial, found doors suddenly open. King Louis XVI and his ministers saw an opportunity to humble their ancient enemy and avenge the losses of the 7 Years' War. As you drift toward deeper sleep, observe the glittering court of Versailles, calculating how American independence could serve French interests, never dreaming that the revolutionary ideals they supported would one day consume their own monarchy. As 1777 ended, the American cause had survived its darkest period, but faced new trials ahead. Washington's army marched into Valley Forge on December 19th, beginning a winter that would test American endurance as severely as any battle. Yet the alliance with France, formalized in February 1778, promised to transform a colonial rebellion into a global war. The British would no longer face only American amateurs, but the professional armies and powerful navy of France, with Spain and the Netherlands likely to follow. The darkest hours had passed, though years of struggle remained. As you sink into peaceful rest, witness the campfires of Valley Forge glowing in the winter darkness, each flame representing hope, kept alive through the most desperate times, ready to blaze forth with renewed strength when spring returned. Turning tides, 1777 to 1778. The snow fell steadily on Valley Forge as December 1777 gave way to the new year, transforming the Pennsylvania countryside into a white wilderness that seemed to mock the suffering of Washington's army. Consider, as you nestle deeper into warmth and comfort, the 12,000 Continental soldiers who marched into this winter encampment, many leaving bloody footprints in the snow, their clothes hanging in tatters, their stomachs empty. Washington had chosen this site, 20 miles northwest of British-occupied Philadelphia, to keep pressure on the enemy while finding defensible ground for winter quarters. What followed would become the most iconic winter of American history, a crucible that would either forge a professional army or witness the dissolution of the American cause. The suffering at Valley Forge was immediate and intense. Soldiers lacked everything: coats, blankets, shoes, food. On December 23rd, Washington wrote to Congress that he had not a single hoof of any kind to slaughter, and not more than 25 barrels of flour. Men huddled in hastily built log huts, 12 soldiers to each 14 by 16-foot structure, trying to survive on fire cake, a tasteless mixture of flour and water cooked on hot stones. Disease ravaged the camps. Typhus, typhoid, dysentery, and pneumonia claimed far more lives than British bullets ever had. By February, nearly 4,000 men were unfit for duty. The hospitals, such as they were, became charnel houses where men often preferred to die with their comrades rather than enter. Yet even in this extremity, the American spirit endured. Martha Washington arrived in February, as she did each winter of the war, bringing a touch of domesticity to headquarters. Other officers' wives followed, organizing clothing drives and nursing the sick. Visualize these women, accustomed to comfortable homes, working in freezing hospitals, writing letters for dying soldiers, and mending uniforms with numbed fingers. Their presence reminded the army what they fought for: not abstract principles, but homes and families, and a way of life worth preserving. Washington himself shared the hardships, refusing comfortable quarters in nearby houses, maintaining his headquarters in the Isaac Potts house at the center of camp, where every soldier could see that their commander remained with them. The transformation of Valley Forge from place of suffering to forge of victory began with the arrival of Baron Friedrich von Steuben in February 1778. This Prussian officer, whose title was partly fabricated and whose English was non-existent, possessed exactly what the Continental Army needed: European military expertise combined with adaptability to American conditions. As you float deeper into restfulness, observe this theatrical figure, resplendent in his European uniform, cursing in German and French when his American translators couldn't convey his meaning, personally demonstrating musket drill to bewildered farm boys who had never learned to march in step. Steuben understood that American soldiers were not European automatons who could be driven by fear of punishment. These were free men who needed to understand why they were doing something, not just how. He simplified Prussian drill to its essentials, creating a system Americans could master. Starting with a model company of 100 men, he taught them to march, to maneuver, to load and fire by volley, to use the bayonet effectively. These men then trained others, spreading professional military knowledge throughout the army like ripples in a pond. By spring, the ragged collection of individuals had become a disciplined force capable of standing against British regulars. While the army transformed at Valley Forge, American diplomats achieved the Revolution's greatest diplomatic triumph. On February 6, 1778, France signed 2 treaties with the United States, one of amity and commerce, the other of military alliance. The French commitment was total. They recognized American independence, promised to fight until Britain did the same, and renounced any claims to British North America. Witness the scene at Versailles as Benjamin Franklin, dressed in plain brown cloth amid the silk and jewels of the French court, charmed everyone with his calculated simplicity. The French saw in him the embodiment of Enlightenment virtues, the natural philosopher from the New World who tamed lightning and tyrants with equal ease. News of the French alliance reached Valley Forge in May, transforming the camp's atmosphere. Washington ordered a grand review to celebrate, and the army that paraded on May 6, 1778, bore little resemblance to the rabble that had staggered into camp 5 months earlier. 13 cannon shots announced the alliance, followed by perfectly executed maneuvers as brigades wheeled and marched with precision that would have graced a European parade ground. The soldiers shouted, "Long live the King of France!" words that would have been treason months before, but now represented salvation. That night, officers gathered at Washington's headquarters for a celebration that mixed American simplicity with attempts at European elegance. The immediate consequence of the French alliance was British evacuation of Philadelphia. With French naval power threatening their sea communications and needing troops to defend against French attacks elsewhere, the British consolidated their forces in New York. The new British commander, Sir Henry Clinton, Howe having resigned after Saratoga, began the evacuation on June 18, 1778. Washington, alerted by his excellent intelligence network, saw an opportunity. The British Army, stretched out along roads through New Jersey and encumbered with a baggage train 12 miles long, presented a tempting target for his newly trained army. The resulting Battle of Monmouth on June 28, 1778, proved that Valley Forge had indeed forged a new continental army. In brutally hot weather, temperatures reached nearly 100 degrees, American and British forces clashed near Monmouth Courthouse. The battle began badly when General Charles Lee, Washington's second in command, ordered a retreat that threatened to become a rout. Washington, arriving on the scene, erupted in one of his rare displays of public fury. Legend says he swore at Lee till the leaves shook on the trees, though witnesses could never agree on his exact words. Taking personal command, Washington rallied the retreating troops and formed a new line. What followed proved that American soldiers could now match British professionals. Through the blazing afternoon, the two armies exchanged artillery fire and infantry volleys. American artillery, commanded by General Henry Knox, proved especially effective. See Mary Ludwig Hayes, known to history as Molly Pitcher, carrying water to parched soldiers and, when her husband fell wounded, taking his place at a cannon. As evening fell, both armies were exhausted. The British slipped away during the night, continuing to New York, while Americans held the field. Tactically indecisive, Monmouth was a strategic American victory, proving the Continental Army could fight European-style battles. The war's nature changed dramatically with French entry. What had been a colonial rebellion became a global conflict. French fleets threatened British possessions in the Caribbean, more valuable to Britain than the 13 colonies. Spain would join the war in 1779, seeking to recover Gibraltar and Florida. The Netherlands would enter in 1780. Britain now faced enemies on multiple continents and oceans, forcing a dispersal of resources that made decisive victory in America increasingly difficult. The Royal Navy, stretched thin protecting commerce and colonies worldwide, could no longer maintain unchallenged supremacy along the American coast. Native American nations faced agonizing choices as the war expanded. Most sided with Britain, seeing American expansion as the greater threat to their lands. In New York's Mohawk Valley and Pennsylvania's Wyoming Valley, brutal warfare erupted between Patriot settlers and British allied Iroquois. Both sides committed atrocities that left lasting scars. The Sullivan Expedition of 1779 devastated Iroquois settlements, destroying 40 towns and vast quantities of crops, earning Washington the Iroquois name Town Destroyer. As you sink deeper toward slumber, consider the tragedy of native peoples caught between empires, fighting to preserve their own independence while the Americans fought for theirs. In the South, the war took on a particularly vicious character. The British, frustrated in the North, developed a Southern strategy based on the belief that Loyalists were numerous in the South and would rise to support the Crown if given protection. Savannah fell to British forces in December 1778, and much of Georgia returned to royal control. The fighting between patriots and loyalists in the back country became a savage civil war of raid and counter-raid, where neighbor fought neighbor and atrocities multiplied. Families divided, communities destroyed themselves, and hatreds were kindled that would outlast the war by generations. The year 1778 also saw the beginning of the war at sea. The Continental Navy, though tiny compared to the Royal Navy, produced heroes like John Paul Jones, who raided the British coast itself. Contemplate Jones on September 23, 1779, his ship Bonhomme Richard locked in deadly combat with HMS Serapis, his vessel sinking beneath him, responding to a demand for surrender with the immortal words, I have not yet begun to fight. American privateers, privately owned vessels authorized to attack British commerce, proved even more effective than the Navy. Thousands of these maritime raiders disrupted British trade, drove up insurance rates, and brought the war home to British merchants who had previously profited from it. As 1778 drew to a close, the nature of the Revolutionary War had fundamentally changed. No longer was it a desperate American struggle for survival against overwhelming British power. It had become a global conflict in which American independence was linked to European power politics. The Continental Army, professional and confident after Valley Forge, could face British regulars on equal terms. The addition of French military and naval power, with Spanish and Dutch involvement looming, meant that British resources would be stretched to the breaking point. Time now favored the Americans. Each year the war continued, made British victory less likely, and American independence more certain. As you drift into peaceful sleep, witness the transformation, from the desperate winter at Valley Forge to an army and a cause renewed, from isolation to alliance, from probable defeat to possible victory. The tide had indeed turned, though years of struggle remained before the waters of war would finally recede. Global War and Southern Campaigns, 1778 to 1780. As the war entered its global phase, the conflict that had begun in the villages of Massachusetts transformed into a struggle spanning continents and oceans. Envision, as you settle deeper into restfulness, the war rooms of European capitals where ministers moved pins on maps, calculating how American independence might shift the balance of power that had governed international relations since the Treaty of Utrecht. In Madrid, King Carlos III weighed the opportunity to reclaim Gibraltar and Florida against the danger of encouraging colonial rebellion. In The Hague, Dutch merchants counted profits from trade with America, while their government maintained official neutrality. Even Catherine the Great of Russia formed the League of Armed Neutrality, protecting neutral shipping rights against British naval power that had long dominated the seas. The British, facing this expanding coalition, made a fateful strategic decision. They would shift their primary effort to the southern colonies, where they believed numerous loyalists awaited liberation. Lord George Germain, directing the war from London, envisioned a campaign that would roll up the colonies from south to north, with loyalist militia controlling reconquered territory, while regular forces moved ever northward. This southern strategy seemed logical on paper. The South's plantation economy depended on exports that British naval power could facilitate or strangle, and intelligence reports suggested that backcountry farmers resented the planter elite who led the rebellion. The campaign began promisingly in December 1778, when Lieutenant Colonel Archibald Campbell's force of 3,500 men easily captured Savannah. Georgia's capital fell in a single day, with British losses of only 7 killed and 19 wounded against American casualties 10 times higher. By month's end, British forces controlled most of Georgia's populated areas. Hundreds of Georgians took oaths of allegiance to the Crown, seemingly validating the Southern strategy. As you nestle deeper into tranquility, consider the jubilation in British headquarters as reports arrived of loyalists flocking to the King's standard, of rebel governments fleeing inland, of the revolution's seemingly inevitable collapse in the Deep South. But the reality of Southern warfare proved far more complex than British planners anticipated. The backcountry erupted in vicious civil conflict as patriots and loyalists settled old scores under cover of political principle. Neither British regulars nor Continental troops could control this irregular warfare. Bands of mounted partisans struck without warning, burning homes, executing prisoners, and spreading terror through the countryside. Men like Thomas Sumter, the Carolina Gamecock, and Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, emerged from the pine forests and cypress swamps to strike British supply lines and loyalist militia, then vanished before regular troops could respond. The attempt to recapture Savannah in October 1779 demonstrated both the new dynamics of Allied warfare and its limitations. A French fleet under Admiral d'Estaing arrived with 4,000 troops to join American forces under General Benjamin Lincoln in besieging the city. For 3 weeks, Allied forces bombarded Savannah while digging siege trenches ever closer to British lines. But coordination between French and American commanders proved difficult, and d'Estaing, worried about the approaching hurricane season, insisted on a direct assault. On October 9th, Allied forces attacked in the pre-dawn darkness. The assault became a bloody fiasco. French and American troops tangled in the abatis, sharpened stakes protecting British positions, while grape shot tore through their ranks. Among the fallen was Sergeant William Jasper, who died trying to plant the colours on British ramparts, and Count Casimir Pulaski, the Polish volunteer who had organized American cavalry. The failed siege of Savannah had profound consequences. French forces sailed away, not to return to American waters for nearly 2 years. The British, emboldened by their success, prepared to expand operations into South Carolina. Most ominously, the battle convinced many Southerners that the Patriot cause was doomed, leading them to make accommodations with British authority. As winter arrived, royal government seemed firmly re-established in Georgia, while partisan warfare raged in the backcountry with increasing brutality. The pattern of Southern warfare was set. Conventional battles mixed with guerrilla raids, neighbor against neighbor, with no mercy given or expected. In May 1780, the British achieved their greatest success of the Southern campaign. General Henry Clinton, bringing reinforcements from New York, besieged Charleston, trapping General Lincoln and over 5,000 Continental troops. For 6 weeks, British siege lines crept closer, while the Royal Navy controlled the harbor. Visualize the elegant city, once the wealthiest in America, under constant bombardment. Cannonballs crashed through tile roofs, fires raged unchecked, and civilians huddled in cellars. On May 12th, Lincoln surrendered the city and his entire army, the worst American defeat of the war. The British captured not just soldiers but the entire continental military establishment in the South, arms, ammunition, and supplies that would take years to replace. With Charleston secured, Clinton returned to New York, leaving Lord Cornwallis to complete the subjugation of the South. Cornwallis, an aggressive commander who believed in vigorous pursuit, immediately dispatched forces to establish posts throughout South Carolina. Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton, commanding the British Legion of American Loyalists, became the terror of the countryside. His green-coated cavalry seemed to appear everywhere, striking with devastating speed. At the Waxhaws on May 29th, Tarleton's men overtook a Virginia Continental Regiment. What followed became infamous as Tarleton's Quarter, the massacre of men trying to surrender, leaving 113 dead and 150 wounded. Whether Tarleton ordered the slaughter or lost control of his men remains disputed, but the incident inflamed American opinion and made quarter increasingly rare in Southern fighting. As summer 1780 arrived, British control seemed complete. Cornwallis reported to Clinton that South Carolina had been pacified, that loyal subjects were returning to their allegiance in great numbers. But beneath this surface calm, resistance simmered. When British officers required all males to take oaths of allegiance and join loyalist militia, they transformed neutrals into enemies. Men who might have sat out the war now faced an impossible choice: fight their neighbors or be branded rebels. The heavy-handed behavior of loyalist militia, settling old scores and plundering under cover of authority, created new patriots daily. Every confiscation, every burned farmhouse, every arbitrary arrest drove more Carolinians into the patriot camp. The Continental Congress, desperate to restore the situation in the South, appointed Horatio Gates to command a new Southern army. Gates, the victor of Saratoga, seemed the logical choice to repeat his northern success. As you float deeper toward slumber, see this general, portly and pompous, confident that British forces would flee before his reputation. He assembled a force of Continental troops and militia, mostly untrained and poorly equipped, and marched directly toward the British base at Camden, South Carolina. Gates ignored the advice of local commanders who understood Southern conditions, choosing a route through barren pine barrens that offered little food for his already hungry troops. The Battle of Camden on August 16, 1780, became one of the most complete defeats in American military history. In the pre-dawn darkness, advance elements of the two armies collided unexpectedly. Both commanders decided to fight where they stood. As dawn broke, Gates deployed his rawest militia against Cornwallis's best troops, including Tarleton's cavalry. When the British lines advanced with bayonets gleaming, the militia broke and ran without firing a shot. Veterans described men throwing away muskets, cartridge boxes, even clothing in their panic to escape. The Virginia and North Carolina militia simply evaporated, many not stopping until they reached their homes. Gates himself fled the field, riding hard for 60 miles before stopping. His behavior destroyed his reputation forever. The Continental troops, mostly Maryland and Delaware regiments, fought magnificently before being overwhelmed. Baron de Kalb, the German volunteer serving as Gates's second-in-command, died heroically trying to rally the troops, suffering 11 wounds before falling. American losses exceeded 2,000 men, while British casualties numbered only 324. The Southern Army ceased to exist as an organized force. Cornwallis seemed free to march northward at will, with no significant American force to oppose him. Yet even in this darkest hour for the American cause in the South, signs of ultimate British failure appeared. The day after Camden, Tarleton surprised Thomas Sumter's partisan force at Fishing Creek, scattering them completely. But Sumter escaped, and within weeks was raiding British supply lines again. These partisan leaders proved impossible to eliminate. When dispersed, their men simply went home, hid their weapons, and waited for the next call to arms. British and Loyalist forces could control only the ground they actually occupied. The moment they moved on, Patriot partisans reappeared like grass growing through cracks in pavement. More significantly, British attempts to raise Loyalist militia proved disappointing. While thousands took oaths of allegiance, far fewer actually took up arms for the king. Those who did often proved unreliable in combat and undisciplined in victory. The brutal civil war in the back country created cycles of revenge that made pacification impossible. Each atrocity by one side provoked retaliation by the other. Neighbor fought neighbor, families split apart, and communities destroyed themselves in orgies of violence that would scar the region for generations. The British had won battles but were losing the war for Southern hearts and minds. The war also exposed the fundamental contradiction of the Southern economy. The British promised freedom to slaves who fled rebel masters and joined their forces, yet they also promised to protect the property, including slaves, of Loyalists. This confused policy satisfied no one. Thousands of enslaved people did flee to British lines, seeking freedom in chaos. Some served effectively in British forces, while others found that British promises meant little in practice. The disruption of the plantation system damaged the economy British forces needed to sustain themselves, while the fear of slave rebellion drove many wavering whites into the Patriot camp. By late 1780, despite tactical victories, British strategy in the South was failing. They could win battles, but not the peace. Every attempt to establish civil government collapsed once military forces moved on. The Loyalist militia they relied upon to control conquered territory proved insufficient and often counterproductive. The partisan warfare Cornwallis dismissed as mere banditry was bleeding his army through countless small engagements. Supply lines stretched hundreds of miles through hostile territory required constant protection. Disease claimed more soldiers than combat. The British army, seemingly victorious, was actually trapped in a hostile land where every citizen might be an enemy, and every victory created new foes. As 1780 ended, Congress appointed a new commander for the Southern Army, Nathaniel Greene of Rhode Island. Unlike Gates, Greene understood that he didn't need to win battles merely to keep an army in the field. His appointment would transform the Southern campaign. Meanwhile, in the North, Washington's army watched and waited, keeping Clinton's forces pinned in New York. The French fleet might return at any time, and when it did, opportunities would arise. As you drift toward peaceful sleep, contemplate the Southern landscape scarred by war. Burned plantations, divided families, communities torn apart by conflicting loyalties. From this chaos would emerge the final acts of the revolutionary drama, as British victories led paradoxically to ultimate defeat. The path to victory, 1780 to 1781. In the waning days of 1780, Nathaniel Greene arrived in Charlotte, North Carolina, to take command of the Southern Army, or what remained of it. Observe, as you nestle deeper into comfort, this Quaker's son from Rhode Island surveying his new command. Barely 1,500 ragged Continentals, their uniforms in tatters, many barefoot, all hungry. Local militia appeared and disappeared like morning mist, unreliable and demoralized after Camden. Yet Greene possessed what Gates had lacked, the ability to see opportunity in adversity and to adapt European military science to American conditions. His first decision shocked conventional military wisdom. He divided his inferior force in the face of a stronger enemy, sending Daniel Morgan with 600 men to threaten British posts in western South Carolina, while he rebuilt the main army. Lord Cornwallis, wintering in Winnsboro, South Carolina, faced an impossible dilemma. Morgan's force, though small, threatened vital Loyalist settlements and British prestige, yet pursuing Morgan meant dividing his own army. Cornwallis dispatched Banastra Tarleton with 1,100 men, his finest troops, including the feared British Legion, to crush Morgan once and for all. Tarleton, supremely confident after his string of victories, pursued Morgan through the cold January countryside of 1781, driving him toward the Broad River, where escape would be impossible. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change the course of the war. Morgan, the old wagoner who had risen through the ranks, chose his ground carefully at a place called Hannah's Cowpens, a well-known grazing area where local farmers gathered cattle. On the night of January 16th, 1781, he walked among his men, joking with veterans, encouraging nervous militia, explaining his unusual battle plan. As you glide deeper into restfulness, witness these soldiers around their campfires, listening to Morgan's gravelly voice promising them victory if they would trust him and stand firm for just 2 shots. He deployed his forces in 3 lines, militia in front with orders to fire 2 volleys, then retreat, Continental troops in the second line, and cavalry hidden behind a hill as reserve. The Battle of Cowpens on January 17, 1781, became Morgan's masterpiece. Tarleton attacked at dawn, his troops advancing confidently as the American militia fired and fled exactly as expected. The British pressed forward, sure of another easy victory, only to encounter the Continental line's disciplined fire. As the battle swayed back and forth, Morgan's retreating militia, rather than running away, reformed behind the hill. At the critical moment, with British troops disordered by their pursuit, the American line about-faced and delivered a devastating volley. Cavalry charged into the British flank while the reformed militia struck the other. In less than an hour, Tarleton's force was destroyed, 110 killed, 229 wounded, and 600 captured. Tarleton himself barely escaped with 40 horsemen. The Americans lost only 12 killed and 60 wounded. Cowpens stunned Cornwallis and infuriated him into a fateful decision. Abandoning his methodical conquest of the South, he burned his baggage train, tents, extra supplies, even rum rations, transforming his army into a light, fast-moving force dedicated to catching Greene. Thus began what historians call the Race to the Dan, one of the war's most dramatic campaigns. Through the cold, wet weeks of February 1781, Greene led Cornwallis on an exhausting chase across North Carolina. American forces always stayed just ahead, burning bridges, exhausting British troops, drawing them ever farther from their bases. The chess match between the two generals captivated observers on both sides. Visualize these armies stumbling through winter rain and mud, crossing swollen rivers, leaving trails of sick and exhausted soldiers. Greene's quartermasters had cached supplies along planned routes. Cornwallis's men marched on reduced rations through countryside stripped bare. When Greene finally crossed the Dan River into Virginia on February 14th, Cornwallis had to halt. His army was exhausted, his supplies depleted, and he was 200 miles from his nearest base. Though he had driven Greene from North Carolina, he had won nothing but empty ground. When Greene recrossed the Dan a week later with reinforcements, the chase resumed in reverse. On March 15, 1781, at Guilford Courthouse, Greene finally offered battle. He deployed his forces similarly to Morgan at Cowpens, with militia in front lines and regulars behind. But Guilford Courthouse was no Cowpens. The woods were thicker, control more difficult, and Cornwallis a more formidable opponent than Tarleton. The battle raged for hours through dense forest and clearings. At the climactic moment, with British and American lines intermingled in desperate hand-to-hand combat, Cornwallis made a ruthless decision. He ordered his artillery to fire grape shot into the melee, killing his own men along with Americans. The devastating fire broke American resistance. Greene withdrew in good order, leaving Cornwallis in possession of the field. Technically, Guilford Courthouse was a British victory. But as Cornwallis surveyed his losses, over a quarter of his force killed or wounded, including many irreplaceable officers, he might have recalled Pyrrhus's ancient lament. Charles James Fox would later observe in Parliament, "Another such victory would ruin the British army." Cornwallis, deep in hostile territory with a damaged army and dwindling supplies, had no choice but to retreat to the coast. He marched to Wilmington, North Carolina, and made another fateful decision. Rather than return to South Carolina to restore the situation there, he would march north into Virginia, seeking the decisive victory that had eluded him in the Carolinas. While Cornwallis marched into Virginia, Greene executed one of the war's most brilliant strategic moves. Instead of pursuing Cornwallis, he turned south into South Carolina and Georgia, attacking the chain of British posts that controlled the interior. Through the spring and summer of 1781, Greene fought a series of battles: Hobkirk's Hill, Fort Mott, 96, Eutaw Springs. He lost most of these tactical engagements, but won the strategic campaign. After each battle, British forces withdrew to stronger positions, abandoning the countryside to Patriot control. As you sink deeper toward slumber, consider the British commanders' frustration as they won battles but lost territory, their control shrinking like a puddle in summer heat until they held only Charleston and Savannah on the coast. Meanwhile, in Virginia, Cornwallis found more frustration than glory. Benedict Arnold, the American hero turned traitor, had been raiding Virginia for the British since December 1780. His defection to the British cause in September 1780 had shocked Americans, the hero of Ticonderoga and Saratoga selling his services for gold and a general's commission. Now he burned tobacco warehouses and recruited loyalists with limited success. When Cornwallis arrived in May 1781, he took command of all British forces in Virginia, creating an army of 7,500 men, the largest British force assembled during the Southern Campaign. Yet Virginia proved no easier to pacify than the Carolinas. The young Marquis de Lafayette, commanding American forces in Virginia, refused to give battle, hovering just out of reach, harassing British foraging parties. Tarleton, reunited with Cornwallis, raided Charlottesville, nearly capturing Governor Thomas Jefferson at Monticello. But these raids accomplished nothing permanent. Cornwallis received conflicting orders from Clinton in New York: fortify a naval base, send reinforcements north, continue active operations. Frustrated and perhaps sensing that aggressive action had led him into a trap, Cornwallis moved to Yorktown on the Chesapeake Bay in August 1781, beginning fortifications for what he assumed would be a quiet naval base. Far to the north, the pieces of a strategic masterpiece were falling into place. In July 1781, French General Rochambeau met with Washington near New York. The French had maintained an army in Newport, Rhode Island, for a year, waiting for an opportunity to strike decisively. Washington initially favored attacking Clinton in New York, but when word arrived that Admiral de Grasse was sailing from the Caribbean with a powerful French fleet and would be available for operations in the Chesapeake, the Allied commanders saw their opportunity. If they could trap Cornwallis at Yorktown before Clinton could reinforce him, they might win the decisive victory that had eluded them for 6 years. The Allied march from New York to Virginia was a masterpiece of deception and logistics. Washington created elaborate camps and ovens around New York, convincing Clinton that the city was the target. Not until the Allied armies had crossed the Delaware did Clinton realize their true destination. By then it was too late. See the scene as American and French troops marched through Philadelphia on September 2nd. Citizens who had seen the British occupy their city now watched as perfectly disciplined French regiments in white uniforms marched alongside Washington's Continentals, their appearance transformed by French supplies. For the first time, American troops marched as equals with European professionals. The concentration at Yorktown represented one of the war's greatest logistical achievements. French engineers, siege artillery, and military expertise combined with American knowledge of local conditions and fighting spirit. On August 30th, de Grasse's fleet arrived in the Chesapeake, disembarking additional troops and sealing Cornwallis's fate. When a British fleet under Admiral Graves attempted to break through, the Battle of the Chesapeake, also known as the Battle of the Virginia Capes, on September 5th, saw de Grasse drive them off. For once, the Royal Navy had lost control of American waters at the crucial moment. Cornwallis was trapped. By late September, Allied forces had assembled around Yorktown, over 17,000 French and American troops against Cornwallis's 8,000. The siege proceeded with textbook precision. French engineers directed the digging of parallel trenches ever closer to British lines. Heavy siege guns, some dragged from Newport, others provided by the French fleet, bombarded British positions day and night. On October 14th, Allied forces stormed 2 key British redoubts. Alexander Hamilton led the American attack, ordering his men to take the position with unloaded muskets and bayonets to ensure surprise. The French attacked the other redoubt with equal gallantry. With these positions taken, Allied guns could enfilade the entire British position. Cornwallis's situation was hopeless. A desperate attempt to evacuate across the York River failed when a storm scattered his boats. Disease ravaged his troops crowded in inadequate fortifications. On October 17th, the 4th anniversary of Burgoyne's surrender at Saratoga, a British drummer appeared on the ramparts beating the parley. An officer waving a white handkerchief was blindfolded and led to American lines. Cornwallis was asking for terms. 2 days later, on October 19th, 1781, the British army marched out to surrender. Cornwallis himself pleaded illness, sending his second-in-command, General O'Hara, to perform the humiliating ceremony. The surrender scene was rich with symbolism. British bands played "The World Turned Upside Down," capturing the Revolution's inversion of traditional order. When O'Hara attempted to surrender to Rochambeau, honoring European professionalism over American rebels, the French general directed him to Washington. Washington, maintaining the fiction that kings didn't surrender to rebels, directed O'Hara to his second-in-command, Benjamin Lincoln, the same general who had been humiliated at Charleston. As British troops marched between lines of French and American soldiers to stack their arms, some wept openly. Others smashed their muskets rather than surrender them intact. When news of Yorktown reached London, Lord North reportedly exclaimed, "Oh God! It is all over." Though the war would continue officially for 2 more years, everyone understood that British will to continue the conflict had been broken. The world had indeed been turned upside down. 13 colonies had defeated the greatest empire on earth. As you drift toward peaceful sleep, witness the victory dispatch racing northward, church bells ringing in every town, citizens pouring into the streets to celebrate not just military victory, but the validation of their revolutionary experiment. The path to victory had been long and tortuous, marked by suffering and sacrifice, but Americans had proven that a people united in defense of their liberties could overcome any odds. The impossible had become inevitable. From war to nation, 1781 to 1789, although the guns fell silent at Yorktown, the transformation from 13 rebellious colonies to a united nation would prove as challenging as winning the war itself. Contemplate, as you settle deeper into tranquility, the morning after the surrender, when American soldiers awoke to realize they had won a war, but now faced the perhaps greater challenge of winning the peace. Washington, ever mindful of precedent, immediately wrote to Congress warning against premature celebration. The British still held New York, Charleston, and Savannah with 26,000 troops. The peace negotiations could fail. The army, unpaid for months, grew restless. Victory had created new dangers that threatened to unravel what 6 years of warfare had achieved. In Paris, American peace negotiators faced a complex diplomatic dance. Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay had to navigate between their French allies, who had their own agenda, and British negotiators eager to split the alliance. The French, hoping to limit American expansion and maintain their influence, proposed boundaries that would have confined the new nation east of the Appalachian Mountains. Spain, which had entered the war for its own purposes, claimed vast territories in the west. As you nestle deeper into restfulness, visualize these American diplomats in the glittering salons of Paris, matching wits with Europe's most sophisticated negotiators while maintaining the facade of simple republicans. The Americans, displaying diplomatic skill that surprised European courts, negotiated directly with Britain in violation of their instructions to consult France at every step. They secured remarkable terms in the preliminary peace signed on November 30th, 1782. Britain recognized American independence and agreed to boundaries stretching from the Atlantic to the Mississippi River, from the Great Lakes to Spanish Florida. American fishing rights off Newfoundland were preserved. British troops would evacuate all posts in American territory. In return, Congress would recommend that states restore Loyalist property, a provision everyone knew would be ignored. When the French learned of the separate negotiations, Franklin smoothly apologized for the lack of consultation, while pointing out that the terms served French interests by weakening Britain. Back in America, the Continental Army faced its greatest crisis not from British guns, but from congressional parsimony. Soldiers who had suffered through Valley Forge and countless battles discovered that the country they had created seemed unwilling or unable to pay them. Officers estimated they were owed 6 years of back pay. In March 1783, anonymous letters circulated through the camp at Newburgh, New York, calling for the army to refuse to disband until paid, hinting at a military coup if necessary. The Republic faced a moment of supreme danger. Would it follow the pattern of history where successful military commanders seized power? Washington's response to the Newburgh conspiracy revealed the character that made American independence possible. On March 15, 1783, he appeared unexpectedly at a meeting of officers. As he began reading a prepared address, he paused, pulled out spectacles, which few had seen him wear, and said quietly, "Gentlemen, you must pardon me. I have grown grey in your service and now find myself growing blind." This simple gesture, reminding officers of their commander's sacrifices, broke the tension. Tears flowed as Washington urged them to maintain their honor and not tarnish their legacy with rash action. The conspiracy collapsed, and with it the threat of military dictatorship. The American precedent of civilian control over the military was firmly established. The formal peace treaty, signed in Paris on September 3, 1783, officially ended the war. Throughout the fall, British forces evacuated their remaining posts. The most poignant departure came from New York on November 25, 1783. Observe the scene as the last British soldiers boarded ships while Washington's army marched down Manhattan Island. At the battery, British soldiers had greased the flagpole and removed the cleats, making it impossible to raise the American flag. An agile sailor had to nail on new cleats and climb the pole while crowds cheered. That evening, Washington bid farewell to his officers at Fraunces Tavern in a scene of manly tears and embraces, then traveled to Annapolis, where Congress was sitting to perform one last service to the Republic. On December 23, 1783, in the Maryland State House, George Washington surrendered his commission as Commander-in-Chief to Congress. European observers watched in amazement. Here was a victorious general voluntarily relinquishing power, returning to private life like the Roman hero Cincinnatus. King George III, told that Washington intended to resign and return to his farm, reportedly said, "If he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world." Washington's resignation established another crucial precedent, that in America, military power would always be subordinate to civilian authority, that no man, however popular or successful, was indispensable to the Republic. Yet the Republic Washington had done so much to create was struggling. The Articles of Confederation, ratified in 1781, created not so much a nation as a league of friendship among sovereign states. Congress could request, but not compel. It could not tax, regulate commerce, or enforce its decisions. Each state issued its own currency, leading to economic chaos. States erected trade barriers against each other. When Massachusetts farmers, burdened by debt and taxes, rose in rebellion under Daniel Shays in 1786–87, Congress had no power to respond. Only the Massachusetts militia, privately funded by wealthy merchants, suppressed the uprising. As you float deeper toward slumber, consider the fear that spread among American leaders. Had they overthrown British tyranny only to fall into anarchy? The crisis convinced American leaders that the Articles of Confederation were inadequate. In May 1787, delegates gathered in Philadelphia for what was supposed to be a convention to revise the Articles. Instead, meeting in secret behind closed doors and windows, despite the summer heat, they created an entirely new form of government. The Constitutional Convention brought together America's most brilliant political minds, Washington presiding in silent dignity, the learned Madison taking copious notes, the aged Franklin offering wit and wisdom, Hamilton advocating for energetic government, and many others who had guided the Revolution now trying to secure its gains. The debates revealed fundamental divisions about the nature of government and society. Large states wanted representation by population. Small states demanded equality. Northern states, their economies based on commerce and free labor, clashed with southern states dependent on slavery. Some delegates wanted a powerful national government. Others feared recreating the tyranny they had just overthrown. The resulting document was a series of compromises, a House based on population and a Senate with equal state representation, a strong executive checked by legislative and judicial branches, slaves counted as 3/5 of a person for representation, and a complex system of federalism dividing power between state and national governments. The Constitution created a framework for government unlike any the world had seen. A republic spanning a vast territory, with power divided among different branches and levels, deriving its authority from "we the people" rather than tradition or force. But the document was silent on many issues that had motivated the Revolution. It contained no Bill of Rights, no guarantee of the liberties Americans had fought to secure. This omission nearly doomed ratification, as anti-federalists in state conventions argued that the Constitution would create a tyranny worse than British rule. The ratification debates of 1787–88 engaged Americans in the most sophisticated political discussion in their history. In newspapers, pamphlets, and convention halls, citizens debated fundamental questions of political philosophy. The Federalist Papers, written by Hamilton, Madison, and Jay to support ratification in New York, provided a brilliant exposition of the Constitution's principles. Anti-Federalists like Patrick Henry and George Mason warned of consolidated power and lost liberties. The promise of amendments protecting individual rights proved crucial to securing ratification. By June 1788, 9 states had ratified, making the Constitution operative. The first federal elections under the Constitution saw no real contest for president. Everyone knew Washington would be chosen. His journey from Mount Vernon to New York, the temporary capital, became a triumphal procession with crowds greeting him at every stop. On April 30th, 1789, on the balcony of Federal Hall overlooking Wall Street, Washington took the oath as the first President of the United States. Witness this scene, the man who could have been king swearing to preserve, protect, and defend a constitution that limited his power, establishing precedents that would govern the office for centuries. The new government faced immediate challenges. The nation owed massive debts from the war. States remained suspicious of federal power. The promises made to secure ratification had to be fulfilled. James Madison, elected to the first Congress, took the lead in drafting amendments that became the Bill of Rights, guaranteeing freedom of speech, religion, and press, the right to bear arms, protection against unreasonable searches, and other liberties Americans deemed essential. Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton proposed a financial program that would establish national credit, assume state debts, and create a national bank, controversial measures that began defining the fault lines of American politics. As the 1780s ended, the American experiment remained fragile and uncertain. Europeans expected the new nation to fragment or fall under the control of a despot. The challenges were enormous: governing a vast territory with primitive communications, reconciling liberty with order, managing relations with powerful European nations, dealing with Native American peoples whose lands Americans coveted, and confronting the contradiction of slavery in a republic founded on human equality. Yet the foundations were laid. The revolution had not just changed governments, but had begun transforming society, unleashing forces that would reshape America for generations. The transition from war to nation had required different virtues than winning independence: patience rather than courage, compromise rather than defiance, building rather than destroying. Many revolutionary leaders found this transition difficult. Samuel Adams, the great agitator, proved less effective as a constructor. Others, like Madison and Hamilton, emerged as architects of the new order. Washington, bridging both eras, provided the steady leadership that held the fragile Union together. As you drift toward peaceful sleep, envision America in 1789, no longer 13 separate colonies or even a confederation, but a nation, imperfect and incomplete, but founded on principles that would inspire the world. The war was won, the peace secured, and the great experiment in Republican government launched into an uncertain but hopeful future. Legacy and eternal echoes, 1789 to present. As you settle into the deepest, most peaceful rest, consider how the story that began with colonial dreams and revolutionary fervor continues to resonate through the centuries, its echoes growing not fainter but stronger with time. The American Revolution was more than a war for independence. It was an idea that refused to be contained within the borders of 13 former colonies. Visualize, if you will, the ripples spreading from that first stone thrown into the waters of history at Lexington and Concord, circles expanding ever outward, touching distant shores and future times in ways the founders could never have imagined. In France, just months after Washington's inauguration, the Estates General convened for the first time in 175 years. French officers who had served in America, Lafayette, Rochambeau, and others, carried home more than military glory. They brought ideas about natural rights, popular sovereignty, and written constitutions. When Parisians stormed the Bastille on July 14, 1789, they acted out their own version of the American script. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, drafted with Lafayette's help, echoed Jefferson's words about self-evident truths. Though the French Revolution would follow a bloodier path than its American predecessor, the connection was undeniable. The American example had shown that ancient regimes could be overthrown, that people could create new governments based on reason rather than tradition. Through the 19th century, the American precedent inspired revolutionaries and reformers worldwide. Simón Bolívar, liberating South America from Spanish rule, studied American institutions and corresponded with American leaders, though he ultimately concluded that South American conditions required different solutions. The Greek struggle for independence from Ottoman rule drew support from Americans who saw parallels to their own revolution. The revolutions of 1848 that swept Europe saw protesters carrying banners quoting the Declaration of Independence. Even where revolutions failed, the American example endured as proof that self-government was possible. Yet the American Revolution's legacy carried contradictions that would take centuries to resolve. The men who proclaimed that all men are created equal maintained a system of chattel slavery that reduced millions to property. This original sin, embedded in the Constitution's compromises, would eventually tear the nation apart. As you nestle deeper into restfulness, consider Frederick Douglass on July 4, 1852, asking his audience, "What to the American slave is your 4th of July?" The principles of 1776 became weapons in the hands of those excluded from their promise, enslaved people, women, Native Americans, immigrants, who demanded that America live up to its founding ideals. The Civil War of 1861 to 65 was, in many ways, the completion of the American Revolution. Abraham Lincoln, at Gettysburg, redefined the nation's purpose, calling for a new birth of freedom that would ensure government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments attempted to extend the Revolution's promises to formerly enslaved people, though another century would pass before the civil rights movement would make those promises real. Martin Luther King Jr., standing before the Lincoln Memorial in 1963, called the Declaration of Independence a promissory note that America had defaulted on for its citizens of color, demanding that the nation finally cash that check. The Revolution's principles proved elastic enough to accommodate transformations the founders never envisioned. Women, entirely excluded from political participation in 1789, used revolutionary rhetoric to demand their rights. When Elizabeth Cady Stanton drafted the Seneca Falls Declaration in 1848, she deliberately echoed Jefferson. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal." The suffragettes who picketed the White House during World War I carried banners asking, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" They were claiming their inheritance from 1776. Immigration transformed America from a nation of predominantly British descent to a global melting pot, each wave of newcomers reinventing what it meant to be American. The Revolution's principles provided the framework for incorporation. Not blood or soil or ancient heritage, but commitment to ideals defined American identity. A peasant from Poland, a farmer from Ireland, a laborer from China could become American in a way they could never become English or French or German. This radical notion that nationality could be chosen rather than inherited was perhaps the Revolution's most revolutionary idea. The 20th century saw America emerge as a global superpower, and with that power came the question of how to apply revolutionary principles in a changed world. Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, Franklin Roosevelt's 4 freedoms, and the Atlantic Charter all drew on the universalist language of 1776. The end of colonialism after World War II saw dozens of new nations emerge, many explicitly citing the American precedent. Ho Chi Minh began Vietnam's Declaration of Independence by quoting Jefferson, though Cold War politics would complicate that relationship. The fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of Soviet communism seemed to vindicate the founders' faith in self-government and individual liberty. Yet each generation has had to grapple anew with what the revolution means. The principles of 1776 have been invoked by radicals and conservatives, interventionists and isolationists, those seeking to expand government power and those seeking to limit it. The Tea Party movement of the 2000s claimed direct descent from the Boston Tea Party, while Occupy Wall Street protesters argued that extreme inequality violated the revolution's egalitarian spirit. These debates are not departures from the revolutionary tradition, but continuations of it. The founders themselves disagreed vehemently about what their revolution meant. The physical symbols of the revolution permeate American life. Independence Hall still stands in Philadelphia, its assembly room preserved much as it was when delegates signed the Declaration. Mount Vernon, Monticello, and dozens of other revolutionary sites attract millions of visitors seeking connection with the founding generation. The Liberty Bell, cracked and silent, remains a powerful symbol, its inscription from Leviticus, "Proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof," taking on meanings far beyond what was imagined in 1776. These places serve as civic shrines where Americans renew their connection to founding principles. In American law, the Revolution's legacy lives through continual reinterpretation. Every Supreme Court decision about individual rights, federal power, or constitutional meaning engages with questions the founders raised but could not fully answer. The Constitution they created was deliberately ambiguous in places, allowing future generations to adapt 18th-century principles to new circumstances. When the court considers whether electronic surveillance violates the Fourth Amendment, or whether campaign contributions constitute protected speech, they are continuing conversations begun in 1787. The Revolution also echoes through American culture, in the mythology of the underdog, the celebration of rebellion against authority, the suspicion of concentrated power, and the faith in new beginnings. From Hollywood films to protest songs, from Silicon Valley startups to grassroots movements, Americans continue to see themselves as revolutionaries, always beginning the world anew. This cultural DNA, encoded in 1776, shapes how Americans see themselves and how the world sees America. Education perpetuates revolutionary memory, though often in simplified form. Every American schoolchild learns about Washington and the cherry tree, a myth that teaches a truth about character. Paul Revere's Ride, popularized by Longfellow's poem rather than historical accuracy, and The First Thanksgiving, conflating pilgrims with the revolutionary generation. These stories, however embellished, transmit values across generations: honesty, courage, gratitude, perseverance. The revolution becomes not just history, but moral instruction. Modern America faces challenges that echo those of the Revolutionary era: how to balance liberty and security, how to maintain unity amid diversity, how to reconcile ideals with practical governance. The COVID-19 pandemic saw fierce debates about government power and individual freedom that would have been familiar to the founders. Questions about immigration, voting rights, economic inequality, and America's role in the world all engage with revolutionary principles. The answers are not always clear, but the framework for debate was established in those crucible years of 1776 to 1789. As you float toward the deepest sleep, consider how remarkable it is that words written by candlelight in Philadelphia continue to shape events in an interconnected digital world. The Declaration of Independence has been translated into hundreds of languages, its principles invoked by democracy activists from Tiananmen Square to Tahrir Square. The Constitution, the world's oldest written national constitution still in effect, has inspired similar documents worldwide. American revolutionary ideals, however imperfectly realized, remain a beacon for those seeking freedom and self-government. The revolution's greatest legacy may be the idea that ordinary people can govern themselves, that political legitimacy comes from the consent of the governed, not the grace of God or the accident of birth. This notion, radical in 1776, has become so widespread that we forget how revolutionary it was. Billions of people now live in societies that at least claim to derive their authority from the people, a transformation in human governance that began when colonial farmers faced British regulars at Lexington Green. Yet the revolution also teaches that freedom is not inevitable or permanent. Each generation must choose to preserve and extend it. The founders knew they were beginning an experiment, not completing one. The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. Jefferson wrote, though subsequent generations have usually found peaceful means of renewal, the work of forming a more perfect union, begun in 1776, continues with each election, each court decision, each citizen who participates in democratic life. As sleep finally takes you, let the echoes of the revolution blend into dreams. From the Old North Church to Independence Hall, from Valley Forge to Yorktown, from the Constitutional Convention to today's ongoing debates about freedom and justice, the American Revolution continues. Its story is not finished, but is still being written by each generation that inherits its legacy and its challenges. The shots fired at Lexington and Concord still reverberate, not as sounds of war, but as reminders that ordinary people, united in common cause, can change the world. In that echo lies both the glory and the burden of the American experiment, forever unfinished, forever beginning, forever calling its citizens to live up to the magnificent promises made in their name. Rest now, knowing that the story continues, that the revolution begun in 1776 rolls on, and that tomorrow offers another chance to help fulfill its promise of liberty and justice for all.